Hey everyone, my name is Ryan. I'm a pastor and I take questions from the internet and I do my best to answer them. I got a big dump of questions this week. Here's one. Explain Calvinism and Arminianism. All right, yeah, that's kind of huge. There's a lot to that question. But sure, let's get into it. This is it's a question I get asked a lot, actually. It's kind of one of the first questions that I learned to ask when I started engaging with theology and paying attention to the fact that there are Christians and they believe different things from one another and playing the game of what's true. And so it's a good introductory question to dip your toe into theology in that respect. I do want to put kind of an asterisk up here and say you should not learn about someone's theology from their theological enemies, right? So when you are studying perspectives on a given text or ideology or movement, it is always best, you're going to get the best information, even if you end up ultimately disagreeing with it, or even if you start out mistrusting it, you're going to get better information from the people who actually believe that thing. They're going to put it in its best possible light. And you want to have heard things from their best possible light in order to really understand them, to know why the people who believe them believe them. So to that end, I should kind of be upfront about the fact that I am a Presbyterian pastor. I'm a pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA, which is a part of the Reformed churches of the world, which comes from the line of theological descent of John Calvin, Calvinism. Now, I feel prepared to speak to Arminianism. I have been in Arminian. I grew up in non-denom Arminian-flavored churches, and I don't feel negative about it or like it's stupid, but I am kind of biased towards the Calvinistic side, and you should know that about me as we engage this topic. All right, so let's get started. Brief boilerplate. They're named after dudes, John Calvin and Jacobus Arminius. They kind of sort of originated these belief systems, but didn't, right? Like Christians had ideas about how we're saved and not saved before these guys, but they started writing letters and making a fuss, and that kind of solidified in history. All right, these are the shapes of the two positions, and so they get things named after them. Arminianism in particular is confusing to a lot of people. It has nothing to do with Arminianism or being in Armenian. It's all about this Dutch guy, Jacobus Arminius. To be Arminian is to believe in the way of Arminius. To be Calvinistic is to believe in the way of John Calvin, who was writing against these basically Arminian before Arminius followers called the Remonstrants, and he kind of disagreed with them and presented the idea that humanity, being totally depraved, is therefore incapable of reaching out to God. We're rotten. We're rotten to our core, and since we are rotten, given the opportunity for life of eternal bliss and happiness and justice in heaven, we, by ourselves, would reject it. And the only way that we are ever going to love God and be loved by God is if God, who is good, does something for us who is evil to make us able/interested in that. Calvin called that process election. And that was kind of a unique idea at the time. If you're aware of Calvin, you're probably aware of Hobbes, right? Bill Watterson named his comic characters after these guys, and so it was around Calvin's time in history. It was some of these early Enlightenment, late Reformation ideas that we started to play with, like, hey, humans aren't good, like at all. Like, not just that we're sinful, we're like, and so, that was the popular idea at the time. Well, Arminius didn't go for any of that. And he proposed a system which basically says that God, being good, gave us free will. And God is able to respect our free will and our sovereign choice, and to respect that sovereign choice both before and after we have signed on the dotted line, prayed the prayer, committed ourselves to follow Jesus. So you can be saved or not saved based on your response to the information of the gospel, and you can lose your salvation if after coming and believing the gospel for a while, you decide that that's all nonsense and you want to walk away from it, then you're not saved anymore. So the issue of Calvinism versus Arminianism comes down to an issue of whose responsibility is it for my salvation? Who ultimately is in charge of whether I go to heaven or hell? Is it God or is it me? And related to that debate or that idea is this question of sovereignty. Because Calvinists, and I would argue all Christians, should believe that God is sovereign, God is in charge ultimately of every last thing in the world. And in order for God to be in charge of every last thing, the buck stops there, which means that the people who go to hell because God let them, chose them, made them go to hell. And that's scary and that's uncomfortable. But the alternative to that is that God is not in control of something. And that's exactly what the Arminians are going to say. They're going to say, well, God is in control. God's the final authority. He's the highest court in the land, but we have free will because God gave us free will. God wanted us to have free will, and so God limits God's own abilities. God limits what God is going to choose to be in control of in order to make room for us to have free will. Free will is an incredibly complicated philosophical concept. I just want to say it's not really a theological concept. I mean, it gets debated a lot by theologians because it's wrapped up in this issue of Calvinism versus Arminianism. But if you read the Bible, you're not going to find any statements about freedom of the will. You're not going to find any statements about the determinism and like the nature of what it means to choose or not choose. You'll see responsibility, right? And so we can make a biblical argument for free will because, hey, God holds people accountable for their actions, so that if that's going to be fair, then those actions must have had a choice behind them. It wouldn't be fair to hold someone responsible for actions they didn't have. But then we go down this whole other rabbit hole, right? Which is that Calvinism doesn't necessarily deny free will. It just doesn't rely upon it. Arminianism relies upon free will. We have to be able to make the statement, hey, God needed free will to exist in order for his salvation system to work the way God wanted his salvation system to work. And that's why some people go to heaven, some people go to hell. In Calvinism, some people go to heaven and some people go to hell because God sends some people to heaven and sends some people to hell. But if I want to put on a red shirt instead of the blue shirt that I put on, I could have had my own free will to put on the red shirt. That might not have been a part of God's sovereign choice, God's sovereign plan, God's control of the universe. To say that God is in control of my eternal salvation is not to say that God is in control of every single choice that I make, but maybe he is. Determinism is also compatible with Calvinism. So, are you in the weeds yet? You feel like you've dipped your toe in? Are you engaging with these ideas? Usually as people start to hear about these ideas, especially if it's for the first time, there are some like guttural reactions, some like, ooh, I hate that, right? And that's cool. That's a part of it. I think Calvinism is, well, people who believe in Calvinism, like me, tend to like think of themselves as more intellectually rigorous and like tough. We are willing to believe uncomfortable things because they are intellectually and biblically justified. And that, I don't know, that has its advantages and disadvantages. I think Calvinists can be pretty obnoxious at times, to be frank with you. But there is, I think, one really important reality that has to do with each of these, which is probably the reason why there exists a controversy. Arminianism is important because it speaks to our responsibility and our commitment. And so when we start talking about Arminianism, we start talking about God's love. We start talking about God's desire to save and God's desire for people to be saved and God's hope that we will respond appropriately. So it puts a lot on me to respond, and it colors God in a very pretty, very loving light. And I think those things are true. I think I should respond well to God, and I think God is loving and pretty. And so if I'm an Arminian, I have a really hard time letting go of those things in order to embrace like, oh, but rigorous Bible, right? But on Calvinism's side, the recognition that God is sovereign, that God is powerful, that God is holy, 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 it paints God in that light, that very righteous, very powerful light, and it gives me this level of assurance that underscores what I would argue is the most important doctrine in Christian theology, that we are saved by grace through faith, and that not of ourselves, that we don't do anything in order to be saved. We're not saved because we're good, we're not saved because we're smart, and we're not saved because we believe the right things. Under Calvinism, we believe the right things because we are saved. And so my salvation is not in the hands of someone as irresponsible and untrustworthy, such a bad decision maker as me, but is instead in the hands of Almighty God. And when you believe all those things and you get all those benefits from Calvinism, you don't want to give those up in order to move over to a more practical, more efficacious, more motivational belief like Arminianism. And that's why I believe both of these beliefs have continued, and this conflict continues in church history, because there are good things that each of these beliefs are saying that are true about God, but that rest on these two positions in a debate. And so whenever we start to engage, even if we pick a side, we find that we're looking for some kind of middle ground somewhere. Is there a way to have both? And that's a question I leave to you. If you liked this answer, I hope you'll share it. I hope you'll let somebody who needs to know the answer to this question see it. If you didn't like it, I hope you'll argue with me. Send me some comments or even make your own video and tell me what I missed about Arminianism or about Calvinism. Tell me I'm not Calvinist enough, or that I was disrespectful of the Calvinistic institution, or that I missed something about Arminianism, or that I inconsistently pronounced Arminianus' name. Finally, if you've got your own question, I hope you'll send it in. I hope you'll ask it, and I can keep answering questions on the internet. And if you've enjoyed these and want to watch more, you can subscribe right down here, and you can watch these other videos where I answer other questions. Thanks.